The subcommittee will come to order. We're meeting today to consider 9 pieces of legislation. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to today's markup by the Communications and Technology Subcommittee of 9 pieces of legislation. They span a range of important priorities to the members of this committee, including broadband mapping, supply chain security, spectrum management, and Stella. First up, we have H.R. 4229, the Broadband Deployment Accuracy and Technological Availability, or DATA Act, introduced by Mr. Loebsack and Mr. Latta, which would require the FCC to take steps to largely address the problems with our current broadband maps. We have talked about incomplete or inaccurate broadband maps for as long as I've been on this committee, and I'm glad that my colleagues were finally able to come together and address this important issue. Next up, we have H.R. 4427, the Mapping Accuracy Promotes Services, or MAPS Act, introduced by Mr. McEachin and Mr. Long. This legislation would specify that it is unlawful to willingly, knowingly, and recklessly submit mapping data that is inaccurate. After that, we will consider H.R. 5000, the Studying How to Harness Our Airwave Resources Efficiently, or the SHARE Act, which I introduced along with Ranking Member Latta. This legislation would establish a program to develop a testbed to facilitate the sharing of federal spectrum. This bill would also require the FCC and the Ntia to provide a report to Congress assessing the applicability of sharing techniques for other important bands. As we begin to see with the CBRS ban, spectrum sharing shows enormous promise, and I believe ultimately it's the future of spectrum policy. Shifting to supply chain security, we have H.R. 4998, the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act, introduced by Chairman Pallone and Ranking Member Walden. This bill will prohibit the use of funds in FCC programs for the purchase and use of telecommunications equipment that poses significant risk to national security. It would also authorize the creation of a program to enable telecommunications service providers to remove and replace untrusted telecom equipment. It's become clear that untrusted equipment in the U.S. telecom networks poses an unacceptable threat, and I'm happy that we were able to come together to address this serious issue. We will also consider H.R. 4461, the Network Security Information Sharing Act, introduced by myself and Mr. Kinzinger. This bill directs federal agencies to establish a program to share risk information with telecom providers and equipment manufacturers. We are in a situation now where too many rural broadband and telecom providers have untrusted Chinese telecom equipment in their networks because no one in the government told them not to use it, even though our government knew about the threat it posed. This legislation will help bridge the gap between small rural providers and national security officials here in Washington. Next will be H.R. 2881, the Secure 5G and Beyond Act, introduced by Ms. Spanberger, Ms. Brooks, and Mr. O'Halloran. After that, we will consider H.R. 4500, the Promoting United States Wireless Leadership Act, introduced by Mr. Wahlberg, Ms. Dingell, Ms. Brooks, and Ms. Clark. We will move on to H.Res. 575, legislation introduced by Mr. Flores and Mr. Soto, expressing the sense of the House that all stakeholders in the deployment of 5G communications infrastructure should carefully consider and adhere to the security recommendations of the Prague Proposals. Finally, we will consider H.R. 5035, the Television Viewer Protection Act, which I introduced. The Television Viewer Protection Act extends for 5 years Stellar's good faith negotiation provisions and allows for the importation of distant signals to unserved households. The act allows smaller cable providers to collectively negotiate retrans with large broadcasters. It also includes transparency and disclosure requirements for telecom and internet service advertisements and bills, as well as remedies for consumers. I want to thank our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you, Mr. Ranking Member Latta, and Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Walden. I want to thank you both for your willingness to work with us and move these bills out of the subcommittee. And we know that there's, especially on the last bill, that there's work to be done, and we look forward to working with you to get a bill out of here that we can both support. So thank you very much. I support all these pieces of legislation, and I hope my colleagues will do the same. With that, I will yield back my time and recognize Mr. Latta, the ranking member of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, I thank the chairman, my friend, for holding today's markup and for working with me and other members of the subcommittee on the many bills before us today. As the lead Republican on H.R. 4229, I am pleased to see the Broadband Data Act on today's markup. For too long, rural America has fallen behind in the digital economy due to the lack of broadband access. This legislation is an important step forward in ensuring that all Americans have access to broadband, by making sure that the FCC and other federal agencies have accurate data on broadband availability in the United States. Congress is exercising its oversight role to ensure that federal funding is appropriately targeted to solve the rural broadband issue. I'd like to thank my good friend, the gentleman from Iowa, for continuing to work with me on my colleagues on this important bipartisan legislation. I'm also pleased to see the SHARE Act on today's markup. As the co-chair of the Wi-Fi Caucus and the Rural Broadband Caucus, I know we must achieve a careful balance as we seek to clear more spectrum for the marketplace. As demand for spectrum continues to increase, we must ensure NTIA has the tools it needs to increase efficiencies among federal users, including through innovative sharing techniques. Well, the CBRS band is a good example that federal incumbents can work with industry and vice versa. The CBRS model is only one of the many emerging spectrum sharing techniques. We should not seek to limit ourselves to one model that may not work in other bands. I thank the chairman for working with me on the legislation. Additionally, I appreciate the work of all the members of the subcommittee who have come together to move forward multiple supply chain bills. These are critical proposals that seek to protect national security and establish U.S. leadership in 5G technology. And I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues across the aisle to get these bills across the finish line. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding today's hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. Let me start out by saying I was glad to see Congressman McCutcheon back with us today. Good to see you. So today, this subcommittee is focused on advancing legislation that will directly benefit consumers, small businesses, and our national security. We'll take action to help ensure the security of our domestic communications networks and those of our allies. We'll take steps to map our broadband internet networks and to free up more of our nation's airwaves. And we'll provide consumers greater transparency and consistency when it comes to their internet, phone, cable TV, or satellite TV bills. And we'll consider the reauthorization of the laws that govern our media markets. Now, I'm especially pleased, Chairman Doyle, that we'll be taking up my Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act. This was introduced with Ranking Member Walden, Subcommittee Vice Chair Matsui, and Representative Guthrie. And our legislation will help protect America's privacy from the prying eyes of foreign governments and will help ensure that our communications networks won't be shut down by our adversaries. Our bill will prohibit the FCC's broadband subsidies from being used to support suspect communications equipment and services. And for suspect equipment that small carriers have already installed, we'll authorize a $1 billion program to replace it. It's hard to overstate the importance of this measure, particularly as reports of foreign surveillance and meddling continue to grow. We'll also consider the Network Security Information Sharing Act introduced by Representative Kinzinger and Chairman Doyle. This bill helps small carriers identify potentially suspect equipment or services before they buy and install it in the networks. And we'll discuss two important bills introduced by Representatives Loebsack, Latta, McCutcheon, and Long that will finally help us produce accurate maps of our broadband internet networks. For the better part of a decade, this subcommittee has tried to tackle the mapping problem, and we're finally going to do something about it. And their legislation, the Broadband Data Act and the MAPS Act, will be a critical step forward in finally connecting unserved and underserved Americans in rural, suburban, and urban areas. Additionally, Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta have introduced the SHARE Act to help our federal agencies share their allocated spectrum with other agencies. This bipartisan bill would also require the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to study our nation's recent spectrum sharing successes to bring more innovative services to Americans. Unlike the spectrum provisions that were included in that other body's National Defense Authorization Bill for 2020, this bipartisan legislation has undergone a robust process of stakeholder engagement in this subcommittee before coming up for today's markup. And finally, I wanted to mention Chairman Doyle's Television Viewer Protection Act. His bill would extend the good faith negotiation provisions for transmission consent for 5 years, while allowing smaller cable companies to negotiate with large broadcasters collectively. Most important, this bill includes central provisions championed by Representative Eshoo to require more consistency and transparency in consumers' bills for communications services. Now, I know my colleagues here have different views regarding this reauthorization, but these provisions are expiring, and if we're going to address them, we must do it now. So in that spirit, I look forward to working together with my colleagues as we prepare to move to the full committee to discuss any concerns in the hopes of building bipartisan consensus on this bill. And in closing, we have 9 good bills, Mr. Chairman, before us today that are going to help consumers, and I would hope that they would receive the bipartisan support they deserve. And thank you, Chairman Doyle, again for having hearings on these and bringing up these important bills today in a timely fashion. Our committee's really doing a lot these days.
Yep.
In 3 subcommittee markups in 2 days, it's pretty good.
Best committee in Congress.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. I now recognize Mr. Walden, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Most of the bills we have today are bipartisan. I might say 8 out of 9. I thank you for your willingness to work constructively with us toward our shared goals of promoting broadband deployment in rural areas, of securing our communications networks, and preserving NTIA's role in managing federal spectrum resources across the federal government. It goes to show you what we can achieve when we work together in a bipartisan way. While I wish we could have spent more time working together this year on a variety of other proposals, I hope we'll continue this momentum going forward. In particular, I want to thank the chairman for taking up H.R. 4998. This is the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act of 2019. In the last Congress, then Ranking Member Pallone committed to working with me on these issues, so I'm pleased to see the committee follow through on this important topic. With our national and economic security at stake, it's time that Congress sends a clear signal that we put our money where our mouth is, literally. I've heard from small rural providers in my district and others around the country who are impacted by calls to replace existing equipment as they seek to stay within their budgets, not to mention within federal programs purchasing guidance to deploy secure and effective products. The message is clear. These providers need certainty going forward, and they could be left in the lurch as they await new CAF II funding that did not include planning for these new prohibitions. And while this reimbursement program is a great step forward in securing our networks, we must ensure that we're not stuck back in this situation 3 years from now when the stakes will probably be only higher. That is why we'll consider legislation today offered by Mr. Kinzinger, H.R. 4461, to ensure these smaller rural broadband providers that typically don't have access to sensitive information will be adequately informed so they do not make the wrong purchasing decisions in the future. Now, switching gears. I'm also pleased to see we're considering broadband mapping legislation today. As everyone in this room is by now well aware, accurate mapping broadband availability in America is an issue I've been working on for 2 decades. As we continue our oversight of Raybaum's Act implementation, we must ensure our universal service programs operate efficiently and effectively, and that begins with the broadband availability mapping that underpins responsible funding decisions. And finally, the elephant in the room. Stellar reauthorization. As most of you know, I've yet to be convinced that we actually need to reauthorize Stellar. For those who see it as a vehicle to continue making media marketplace reforms, I'm going to tell you this committee can and should examine such reforms under regular order and under their own merits, not as add-ons to an outdated policy. Moreover, for those who claim that 870,000 consumers could lose access to TV content, I say show me the numbers. Nobody's been able to see them in detail. Meanwhile, broadcasters have committed, Chairman Graham in the Senate, they'll work in good faith through the transition away from the distant signal license to a free and fair market to ensure consumers are protected. While I have my doubts on the need to reauthorize Stellar, I remain committed to talking with my friends in the majority as they work toward the full committee. So we'll continue to have those discussions. I am obviously a little concerned about the process on Stellar, but we'll talk about that later. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Do other members seek recognition to make an opening statement? Chair recognizes Mr. McNerney for his opening statement.
I thank Chairman Doyle for holding this markup. I'm glad that we are considering several pieces of important legislation today, including legislation that would help us better target funding for broadband access. Throughout my district, there are areas for which we don't have adequate data to understand if people living there have broadband access. This is unacceptable. The legislation before us today will ensure that we have more granular and accurate broadband maps, which in turn will help ensure that communities across the country, including those in my district, have broadband access. Also, along with Ranking Member Walden, I'm glad that we're taking up H.R. 4998. This legislation incorporates H.R. 4973, the Trusting Commercial Communications Network Act of 2019, which I introduced along with my friend and colleague, Congressman Long. Our bill would prohibit the use of federal funds for communications equipment such as Huawei and services that pose a risk to our national security. This prohibition is critical for keeping potentially bad actors out of our telecommunications supply chain while protecting American consumers, which we need to be cautious about as we build and implement 5G networks. I'm pleased to see that a similar provision has been included in H.R. 4998. I thank the chair for holding this markup, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, are there any members on the Republican side wish to make an opening statement? Seeing none, members, Chair recognizes Ms. Clerk for 3 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our Ranking Member Latta for holding this subcommittee markup today on these 9 bills that will help thrust America forward and reestablish us as leaders in the tech and telecommunications space. Today, the Energy and Commerce Committee will discuss issues ranging from improving broadband deployment to new ways of sharing spectrum with federal agencies. I'm excited to co-sponsor H.R. 4500, the Promoting United States Wireless Leadership Act of 2019, introduced by my colleagues from Michigan, Congressman Wahlberg and Congresswoman Dingell. As the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Smart Cities, I aim to ensure that the U.S. is a front runner in the race to 5G. Our leadership will ensure that we remain ahead of China in this race to 5G and that we advance into the future with trusted American companies paving the way forward. I look forward to a productive markup with my colleagues to bring these important bills to the full committee and then to the House floor. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
General Lady yields back. Anyone wish to make an opening statement? Seeing none, back to the Democratic side. Anyone wishes to be recognized? Ms. Matsui, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased we're coming together today to consider legislation to secure our telecommunications networks, improve broadband mapping, and promote new uses for federal spectrum. I also look forward to an important discussion about the future of television programming. The Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act that I introduced with Chairman Palona Walden and Congressman Guthrie addresses the threat posed by Huawei and other vulnerable network equipment manufacturers head-on. Our bill would require the FCC to establish a list of communications equipment that can be exploited for espionage and cyber attacks and prohibit FCC funding from being used to purchase such equipment. It would also create the Secure and Trusted Communications Reimbursement Program to help communications providers remove vulnerable equipment from their networks and replace it with newer, secure equipment. Helping small and rural wireless providers replace vulnerable network equipment is a necessary step that will boost national security, and I thank the other original co-sponsors for their efforts on this bill. I'm also pleased to see legislation included on the agenda that will help us better map broadband availability. We cannot close the digital divide until we have a clear understanding of where broadband is available and where it is still needed. Additionally, I support the inclusion of legislation on the agenda that will reinforce America's position in the race to 5G and beyond. The bills we will advance today will help reassert America's involvement in international standard-setting bodies, improve supply chain security, and promote innovative uses of federal spectrum. I'd also like to acknowledge the inclusion of the Television Viewer Protection Act. This is an important first step, and look forward to working with my colleagues to support consumers and promote competition in the modern media marketplace. I appreciate the committee's work on these bills, and I appreciate looking forward to supporting them. Thank you, and I yield back.
General Lady yields back. Anyone wish to make an opening statement? Look back. Okay. Mr. Lujan, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Latta, of course, Chairman Pallone, and Ranking Member Walden for the markup today. Today, the Technology and Communications Subcommittee will act on legislation to secure our nation's communication supply chain, make better use of our nation's airwaves, and fix our nation's broadband maps. I want to focus on the last one for a moment. FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel has said that, quote, connecting this country is the central infrastructure challenge of our day because the future belongs to the connected. Unfortunately, when it comes to broadband access, far too many communities have been left behind. According to the FCC, more than 21 million Americans lack access to high-speed fixed broadband. It's hard to get information when it comes to who's not connected with wireless connectivity as well. Here's the thing. Because of the problems with how broadband data is collected and mapped, nobody knows what numbers are accurate. The problem could very well be significantly worse, and probably is. Today, the committee will advance legislation to improve our nation's broadband maps so that everyone knows where to make the investments on how to connect the country, how to connect our communities and our constituents. This is a bipartisan and common sense bill that includes ideas from all corners of this committee. I especially want to thank committee leadership for working with me to advance a proposal to leverage our nation's postal trucks and other federal fleet vehicles to collect broadband data. In addition, I'm pleased that the bill includes provisions to help communities participate in the process. I want to acknowledge the leadership of Mr. O'Halloran, Mr. Barakis, and Mr. Wahlberg for partnering on an amendment to further improve the challenge process. Now, the challenge process may be something that's foreign to many. It was a term that I had to get familiar with. The challenge process emboldens local communities, local governments across America to come together to challenge maps that have been filed. Now, when I get those nice brochures that show that there's connectivity across America, and I know when I'm driving, as many of my constituents and those of you in this room are, you know where the phone calls drop. You know where you can't make a call. You know where those valleys are where there's no connectivity. Why not empower local governments to come together to have a process where they get technical support to challenge that? That's the importance of this. Lives are at stake. I've often shared the story of Ashlyn Mike, a young Navajo girl who in 2016 was kidnapped, murdered, and raped. The Amber Alert system didn't work. Connectivity in that community was non-existent. We have to close this divide, not just for educational opportunities and the gains that are made across the country, but to save people's lives. And then lastly, as I close, I want to commend Chairman Walden. More work is needed, especially as we talk about Stella and how we can get to close these gaps as well. So I look forward to working with my colleagues to get the job done. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else that wants to make an opening statement? Okay, seeing none, that concludes our opening statements. Pursuant to committee rules, members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. Please submit written opening statements to the clerk's desk. At this time, we will begin bill consideration. The chair calls up H.R. 4229, the Broadband Deployment Accuracy and Technological Availability or Broadband Data Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4229, a bill to require the Federal Communications Commission to issue rules relating to the collection of data
Without objection,
with respect.
the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will now recognize Mr. Loebsack to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I do have an amendment in the nature of substitute.
What is the amendment labeled?
It's an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Okay. You have it? Okay, great. Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Oh, I'm sorry. Clerk, go ahead.
Amendment in nature of a substitute to H.R. 4229 offered by Mr. Loebsack of Iowa and Mr. Latta of Ohio. Strike all
Without
after the
objection,
enacting
the
clause.
reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Loebsack, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle and Chairman Pallone and Ranking Members Walden and Latta for having this markup today on the Broadband Deployment Accuracy and Technology Availability Act, or Broadband Data Act. I'd like to particularly thank Ranking Member Latta, Representative McEachin, and it's great to see him here today. I really appreciate his presence, and Representative Long as well for all their hard work to bring the Broadband Data Act to completion. I also want to congratulate Representative McEachin and Representative Long on their bill on markup today, the MAPS Act, which is a great bill and will also be very important in getting better broadband maps. As the folks here know, I've long been an advocate for better maps and the needs of rural Americans, and the Broadband Data Act is a significant step in that direction. Specifically, this bill will require the FCC to establish a process to ensure we're getting better and more accurate data about where broadband is and isn't. Ensure that individuals, third parties, and local and tribal governments have a voice in challenging bad data when they see claims of service where there isn't service. And this bill would require the creation of consumer-facing maps so that consumers and small businesses know when and where coverage is available in their areas or areas they may want to move to, like Iowa. We had our legislative hearing on the Broadband Data Act in September, and at that time I said that I believed we had a bill that was ready for markup and passage on the House floor. However, I also said that I believed there were some common sense changes that we could make that would make this bill even better. And since that time, I'm proud to say that because of the great conversations our offices have had with each other and stakeholders, we have an amendment that makes this bill even better than the original draft. In the amendment I'm offering with my colleague, Representative Latta, and I want to thank him as profusely as I can for working with me on this, we have first created additional clarity that this bill will keep data publicly available. Second, added an authorization of funding to ensure we're getting resources ready to improve these maps. Third, included a provision to ensure the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, assesses and reviews the FCC's progress to make sure it's using the right data sources. And fourth, we've added technical assistance for small providers to ensure we're not overburdening small business and giving everyone an opportunity to compete. Again, this is after multiple conversations we had and among our staff as well. This amendment clearly makes our good bill better, and I think it is a great example of the good bipartisan work this committee does, and I'm proud that we've been able to work together to bring this bill to completion. So in closing, I thank Chairman Doyle and Latta for operating this subcommittee in a way that encourages this great bipartisan work. And I again thank my colleagues for working with me to create a bill that will finally fix the maps. Fingers crossed. Thank you again. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Mr. Wahlberg.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank Representatives O'Halloran, Bilirakis, and Lujan for allowing me to join on this important amendment. This amendment would improve this bipartisan bill by further refining the challenge process and focusing resources on the truly unserved. Citizens of Michigan's 7th District have faced the struggles of inaccurate mapping. Knowing where service is and where service is not is vitally important to better focusing federal resources. Additionally, having a better record of the areas where service access is available and the speeds at which the service is available are critical to preventing overbuilding. I'm pleased to act today on this important topic to get internet access to the unserved and underserved. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? Mr. Latta.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank my friend, the gentleman from Iowa, for all of his hard work on this legislation. I've always said that we've gotten along well working together because we both come from from states with 4 letters with 3 vowels. So I appreciate all the work that we've done together through the years. And, you know, we have been working on these for several years, and I'm pleased to see the focus this subcommittee and Congress has placed on the mapping issue. With the investment of federal funds, it is important that we get the maps right I know our Republican leader, the gentleman from Oregon, has spoken about this issue at length, and we saw the impacts of not having accurate maps at the start of this decade. And right as this decade is coming to a close, we're taking important action to address those issues going forward. I know the subcommittee has a long history of working across the aisle to achieve real benefits for American consumers. And while moving this bill today represents a great step in that direction, I hope we recognize there is still work to be done. I look forward to continue working with my friends on further opportunities to promote broadband deployment in our rural communities in a fiscally responsible manner. And again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you bringing this bill up, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members who wish to speak on this amendment? For what purpose does Mr. O'Halloran rise? Well, one second. Are there any other people that want to speak on this amendment? Okay, seeing none, are there any members who seek recognition to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Chair recognizes Mr. O'Halloran. For what purpose do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the amendment at the desk.
Clerk have the amendment?
Yes.
Okay, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4229 offered by Mr. O'Halloran. Page 17, line 18, strike.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. We have a point of order. Okay. Are the amendments being passed out? Okay, the gentleman, Mr. O'Halloran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta, I want to thank you for working with this amendment. I also want to thank Mr. Barakis, Mr. Lujan, and Mr. Wahlberg for their work. Today, we take an important step to address a problem that has disadvantaged so many areas across rural America: woefully inaccurate broadband maps. I'm proud of our work to put forward a comprehensive mapping bill that moves us closer to our goal of identifying which parts of America remain underserved. This summer, I was pleased to see the FCC adapt several mapping principles from the bipartisan legislation I introduced with my colleagues, the Broadband Data Improvement Act, that are also reflected in the comprehensive bill before us today. These principles include requiring more granular coverage data to be collected from internet providers, including in serviceable locations. These principles include allowing for the public as well as state, local, and tribal government input to challenge the accuracy of the maps on a rolling basis. This will ensure that we have the most updated information available when making infrastructure investments. Rural America has suffered for far too long as a consequence of inaccurate maps that exaggerate where broadband service exists and don't accurately show where it does exist or does not. Only 40% of rural Arizona has access to standard internet speeds. While our children struggle to do their homework, our families struggle to access critical health services that are moving online, and our businesses struggle to compete in online marketplace. My bipartisan amendment clarifies that the public input process for the maps created under this bill should be user-friendly and also increase transparency for the public and its findings. I'm pleased to support my good friend, Mr. Lopesak's legislation to continue to build upon our recent mapping success and make sure no community is left underserved. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan amendment and the underlying bill. I now yield my colleague, Mr. Barakis of Florida, the balance of my time.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it very much. First, I'd like to say that I support the underlying bill. This bipartisan amendment strengthens the bill by ensuring that the failures and successes of a previously created challenge process be considered in the creation of this mapping challenge process. In short, let's make sure we learn from past mistakes, especially on the broadband mapping, where everyone can agree has had flaws in the past. The amendment also provides protections for public input and transparency in the challenge process by ensuring all relevant information is displayed clearly in multiple user-friendly formats. This provides the best chance for the public to identify and challenge mapping errors, and that's so important. For these reasons, Mr. Chairman, I stand behind this amendment and I urge passage. And I'll yield back to the gentleman. Thank you.
Mr. Helen, you yield back? Is there any other member seeking to speak on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, if there's no further debate, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of the substitute? Seeing none. Okay, so we're just going to do a voice vote. Okay, if there's no further discussion on the amendments, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended will signify by saying aye. All those opposed will signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. Okay, the amendment in the nature of the substitute to H.R. 4229 is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably forwarding H.R. 4229 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of favorably forwarding H.R. 4229 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. H.R. 4229 as amended is favorably forwarded to the full committee. The chair now calls up H.R. 4227, the Mapping Accuracy Promotes Services, or MAPS Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4227, a bill to prohibit the submission to the Federal Communications Commission of
Without
broadband.
objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. The bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to offer a bipartisan amendment? Is there anyone that wishes to speak on the bill? Chair recognizes Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, let me thank all the committee members for their warm welcome back to the committee. I've missed you all.
We've missed you, too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Doyle and Mr. Chairman Pallone, for convening today's markup and including legislation that addresses an issue of utmost importance to me and my constituents, ensuring access to high-speed internet for rural and underserved communities. As we all know, access to fast, reliable, and affordable broadband internet services are critical. Without these services, businesses and jobs relocate. Community health suffers due to less connected hospitals and less connected providers. And too many children lack much-needed internet access to complete their homework. Despite funding and bipartisan support, rural broadband deployment has lagged behind where it should be for far too long. We have spent billions of dollars to expand broadband internet services in rural America, and yet, while some progress has been made, we are still in need of greater expansion. Excuse me. In order to address this problem, we first need to understand where broadband services currently exist. If we know where broadband services is needed, we can focus our efforts and funding to those areas. This means we need better coverage maps, which in turn requires internet service providers to submit accurate coverage and quality of service data to the FCC. My legislation, the Mapping Accuracy Promotes Services Act, or MAPS Act, makes inroads towards this goal. The MAPS Act is simple, yet crucial. It makes it unlawful for internet service providers to willfully, knowingly, or recklessly submit inaccurate coverage or quality of service information to the FCC. Once passed, this legislation will prevent incidents like what happened in Virginia with barrier-free and give greater certainty to entities with or without federal funding looking to provide broadband services to underserved communities. I want to thank Mr. Long, my Republican co-lead on the MAPS Act, Mr. Loebsack and Ranking Member Latta for their work on the Broadband Data Act, which will provide larger statutory framework for how providers submit and how the FCC collects data. And Chairman Pallone and Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Walden, and their staffs, I thank you all for prioritizing rural broadband expansion. I look forward to this bill becoming law and working together to ensure broadband access to all rural and underserved communities. I urge my colleagues to support passage of the MAPS Act, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Are there other members seeking recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman, Mr. Long, seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank Representatives Donald McEachin for his work on H.R. 4427, the Mapping Accuracy Promotes Services Act. I'd also like to thank my buddy Representative Dave Loebsack and Bob Latta for their work on the Broadband Data Act. For rural communities such as those in the best state in the union, access to broadband is scarce. Mapping graphically displaying where broadband is and is not available at certain speeds is a critical tool in closing the digital divide. It is crucial federal broadband programs are using accurate data and up-to-date maps to target the areas that need the funding the most. Mr. Chairman, the MAPS Act will provide appropriate enforcement measures to ensure provider submissions are complete and accurate, and I hope it will garner strong bipartisan support. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else wishes to speak on the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4227 to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 4227 to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Opposed, signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 4227 is forwarded to the full committee. The chair now calls up H.R. 5000, the Studying How to Harness Airwave Resources Efficiently or SHARE Act of 2019. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5000, a bill to amend the National Telecommunications and Information Administration
Without
Organization
objection,
Act.
first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and is open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to offer amendments? If not, I will now recognize myself to speak on the bill. I just want to thank my colleague on this bill, Ranking Member Latta, and his staff for their hard work and dedication in getting this bill to this point, as well as the wide range of stakeholders that provided substantive and technical assistance on the development of this legislation. Spectrum sharing technologies offer enormous promise for the future of wireless policy, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on this issue moving forward. I support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I yield back my time. Is there recognition? Mr. Latta, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you very much for working with me on this very important piece of legislation. As I mentioned in my opening statement, it is important that we maintain a careful balance as we seek to clear more spectrum for the marketplace. While we often focus on the importance of clearing low, mid, and high band spectrum, we are seeing the potential benefits that sharing spectrum may offer. This is not to say that we should not continue to work towards clearing additional spectrum, but in certain circumstances, unique forms of sharing may be appropriate, and we should support finding every bit of efficiency in a given spectrum band. It is critical for the economy, it is critical for the public interest to make the best use of our airways. Likewise, it is important that we continue to encourage innovation in all forms of sharing and not limit ourselves to what may work in one band. while we await the auction of priority access licenses, the CBRS B-band next summer to better evaluate the effectiveness of that sharing technique, we must continue to push the envelope on other approaches to sharing that extend beyond the tiered approach in that band. The SHARE Act reaffirms our bipartisan commitment to addressing these important issues in the Energy and Commerce Committee. While we may sometimes disagree on the policy, we all recognize that this committee's expertise should extend in a holistic manner to all spectrum resources, federal, non-federal, and shared use. This is increasingly important as more and more industries become connected and place stronger demand on the FCC to make spectrum more available for a variety of issues. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else that wishes to speak on the bill? Okay, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 5000 to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 5000 to the full committee will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. H.R. 5000 is forwarded to the full committee. Okay, the chair now calls up H.R. 4998, the Secured and Trusted Communications Network Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4998, a bill to prohibit certain federal loan grants and subsidies from being used to purchase communications equipment or
Without
services.
objection, first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and is open for amendment at any point. Are there members seeking recognition to offer an amendment? The chair recognizes Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I have a manager's amendment at the desk, MGR 01.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4998, offered by Mr. Pallone and
Without
Mr.
objection,
Wall.
the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ranking Member Walden and Subcommittee Vice Chair Matsui and Representative Guthrie for partnering with me to introduce the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act. Our legislation will prohibit the spending of federal dollars from FCC programs on suspect communications equipment and services that undermine national security. It also establishes a $1 billion reimbursement program to help small carriers remove compromised equipment and replace it with more secure and reliable alternatives. The increasingly globalized supply chain for telecommunications equipment presents new security challenges for the United States. For almost a decade, some foreign nations have sought to infiltrate the global supply chain for communications equipment. For instance, a 2012 report from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence found that China has the means, opportunity, and motive to use its telecommunications companies for malicious purposes. And just last year, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission found that China has invested significant state capital and influence in efforts to insert state-owned enterprises in the U.S. telecommunications supply chain. Those companies, namely Huawei and ZTE, account for roughly 30% of the global market for this equipment. And although the larger American carriers have avoided purchasing and installing Chinese equipment in their networks, many of the smaller and more rural providers built their networks using Huawei or ZTE equipment because it was cheaper. Today, we can say with more certainty that the existence of this equipment in American networks is a threat to the critical infrastructure components that run on these networks, and that's why it's in the national interest to help smaller and rural carriers remove suspect equipment from our networks. So I urge my colleagues to support the manager's amendment and then the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Mr. Walden for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to also thank my friend Chairman Pallone for working with me on this legislation and for honoring his commitment from last Congress. As I mentioned earlier, this committee is its best when we work this way. And for a long time, we've been talking in D.C. about the vulnerabilities in our data networks, but as we all know, that message didn't always get out to some of the small rural providers who are just every day trying to deliver service to the hardest to reach areas of our country. And even when it does, those same providers have told us they're in a tough spot. I think Congress has set the expectation that going forward, folks need to be paying attention to the security of their networks, and we're going to help by giving them the tools they need. but it's important to underscore that we must have secure communications networks, especially when more and more parts of our economy rely on broadband or wireless communications access to provide critical services. So this legislation gives the Federal Communications Commission the ability to act quickly to assist small rural service providers to ensure that all networks are secure. I understand that we will continue to work with our colleagues across the aisle between now and the full committee markup to ensure that the FCC's administrative costs are capped at a reasonable level, to make sure that the money authorized actually goes to where it's needed most, and that's to the carriers to replace the equipment. While today represents a big step forward, we'll continue to monitor the situation because our work in this space is never done. I know some countries like to prop up their pet companies to achieve strategic advantages, and we don't do the same here in the United States. But we do need to take a hard look at how we can leverage our market incentives to better align with our national and economic interests where we're falling behind. So I look forward to keeping an eye on this and working with you going forward. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back and encourage our colleagues to support this.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? For what purpose does the gentlelady from California?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Escher, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I want to thank you for having this provision in the bill. I think it's not only in rural America's interest. I think this is a national security issue, and I have for years. As some of you will recall, I served for almost a decade on the House Intelligence Committee. Now, that's getting to be a long time ago. But I raised the issue relative to Huawei at that time and what it represented in terms of our telecommunications networks in our country. When our nation was attacked, there was one thing that we had that was the true gold in the aftermath, and that was our nation's telecommunication system. So the security of that system, what rides on it is a national security issue, and while this is a targeted piece of legislation, it nonetheless, I think, speaks to what I'm speaking to right now. So I want to thank the chairman for having this in the bill and the members that have worked on it. I still think that we have to be vigilant in terms of ZTE and Huawei. They are not going away. And this committee should always be in the forefront on that one. I think we have the responsibility, I think we have the wherewithal, and I think that it's a necessity. But I wanted to raise it and say thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. If there are no further amendments to the bill, we will now move to forwarding H.R. 4998 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 4998 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and H.R. 4998 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. Okay. Chair now calls up H.R. 4461, the Network Security Information Sharing Act of 2019. The clerk will report the amendment.
H.R. 4461.
I'm sorry, report the bill.
I'm sorry. 4461? Okay. H.R. 4461, a bill to direct the Secretary of Homeland Security to establish a program.
Without objection, first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk have the amendment. Clerk
Yes,
will
sir.
report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4461 offered by Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois.
Without
Page 4,
objection,
strike
the
line 15 through.
Reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding and also for co-leading both the underlying bill and this amendment. As I've said before, the security of American communications and information networks are paramount to our national security. As we've seen, certain foreign adversaries have systematically coerced equipment manufacturers to embed backdoors and other capabilities into their products. These products are later purchased by American companies and integrated into our networks. No foreign actor should have the ability to eavesdrop on our citizens or our government, let alone use any of these backdoors to launch cyber attacks or to disrupt our communications. To help the private sector avoid purchasing or installing this dangerous equipment, I worked with the chairman to introduce H.R. 4461, the Network Security Information Sharing Act, which is now under consideration. So I asked my colleagues to support this amendment as well as the underlying bill. And with that, unless anybody else wants to speak, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I'd like to thank my colleague on this bill, Mr. Kinzinger, for working together on this important legislation. It's critical that we enable information sharing partnerships between the federal government and small telecom providers. The risks of untrusted network equipment cannot be understated. What's frustrating is that large telecom providers knew about the dangers of equipment from companies like Huawei and ZTE years ago because of warnings from inside our government. But the smaller providers didn't get the same heads up, and when faced with rumors about untrusted equipment versus concerns about their bottom lines, they went with the bottom line. My hope is that this legislation will help these folks partner with our experts in the government who can warn them about these kinds of threats in the future. I support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I yield back my time. Is there anybody else that wants to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, we will proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the legislation? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4461 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 4461 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The ayes have it, and H.R. 4461 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. Okay, the chair now calls up H.R. 2881, the Secure 5G and Beyond Act of 2019. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2881, a bill to require the president to develop a strategy to ensure the security
Without objection,
of
first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and is open for amendment at any point. Is there anyone who wishes to offer an amendment? For what purpose does the gentleman, Mr. O'Halloran, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have, in the nature of a substitute amendment, it's at the desk.
Okay. Pardon me? Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2881 offered by Mr. O'Halloran of Arizona and Mrs. Brooks of Indiana. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. O'Halloran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to also thank Ms. Spanberger, Mrs. Brooks, and that's it for now. The new advances in technology we are seeing today are not only examples of what we can accomplish when we foster innovation, but also a reminder for America to maintain leadership in the era of 5G technology. The promises of 5G are immense. Cutting-edge telemedicine capabilities, online learning for students nationwide, and other emerging technologies. To safely achieve our goals with 5G, we must have a comprehensive interagency strategy in place to ensure that we are secure from foreign threats to our 5G infrastructure. I'd like to thank the chair for all the work that he and others have done to make sure that this is a bipartisan process that is collaborative with the Senate and House Foreign Affairs Committee, which led the Secure 5G and Beyond Act before us today. This bipartisan amendment makes technical changes to ensure the strategy our government puts in place is comprehensive and puts our nation on a path to fully achieve 5G security goals. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan amendment and also the underlying bill. I now yield to my colleague, Ms. Brooks from Indiana.
Move to strike the last word. I thank my colleague, Mr. Halloran, for your leadership on this amendment. I'm pleased to see the committee consider the amendment in the underlying bill, the Secure 5G and Beyond Act. As co-chair, along with my colleague Debbie Dingell of the 5G caucus, we know how critically important it is that we ensure our nation to be prepared for all the opportunities that 5G will bring. But we also must ensure that we're prepared to deal with the risk that it presents as well. H.R. 2881 and the amendment will require the President to develop a strategy to ensure the security of next-gen mobile telecommunication systems and infrastructure, will ensure there's a unified whole-of-government response to those risks, and will allow for industry to work collaboratively with the government to ensure the integrity of the operations of 5G. I look forward to ensuring this legislation is in its best form to address this important issue, and I yield back.
General yields back. Are there any other members seeking to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Okay. Seeing none, are there members who seek recognition to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purposes does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2881, offered by Mr. Cardenas of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Reps Spanberger, Brooks, and O'Halloran for their leadership with H.R. 2881 and the Secure 5G and Beyond Act. The U.S. needs a national strategy for encouraging companies to keep innovating, developing, and implementing 5G while keeping our country safe and protecting consumers. We need a plan that keeps America competitive on the global stage while never compromising our national security. The Secure 5G and Beyond bill helps to create that much needed path. Congresswoman Brooks and I are offering an amendment that bolsters an important idea of this bill, which is that the federal government should not nationalize fifth or any future generations of mobile telecom systems. We can all agree that private investment in infrastructure, competition, and right-sized government involvement have made America a leader in innovation. That's why our amendment specifies that the strategy laid out in the Secure 5G and Beyond Act may not include a proposal involving commercial spectrum unless it's first approved by the FCC. We need to protect the billions of dollars of investments that these companies have made. We need to protect the competitiveness of American companies as they develop these 5G technologies. And we need to keep in mind, as we do this important work, that the federal government's role is to support innovation, not hinder it. Because all of this, at the end of the day, translates to things like good-paying jobs, running your business over the internet, closing the homework gap, getting to watch our favorite sports teams with friends and family. So I thank my colleagues for their support of this amendment to ensure that America remains competitive and a leader in technology and innovation. And I yield back the last 3 minutes of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Seeing none, are there any members that wish to offer any more amendments? Seeing none, we will now proceed to a vote on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. If there's no further discussion and no further amendments, we will proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2881 is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2881 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of favorably reporting Forwarding H.R. 2881 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and H.R. 2881 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.R. 4500, the Promoting United States Wireless Leadership Act of 2019. The clerk will report the amendment.
H.R. 4500, a bill to direct the Assistant Secretary of Communications and Information to take certain actions.
Without
to
objection,
enhance-
the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there members seeking recognition to offer an amendment? For what purpose does the gentleman, Mr. Wahlberg, seek recognition?
Strike the last word to offer an amendment.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4500 offered by Mr. Wahlberg of Michigan, Mrs. Dingell of Michigan, Mrs. Brooks of Indiana.
Without objection, the reading of
Clark
the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would simply clarify trusted in the language of the bill. It doesn't change the intent at all. Today, we're here to discuss not only the future of our nation's telecommunications industry, but also setting the landscape of America's leadership across the world in 5G. As a co-chair of the Congressional 5G Caucus, I've made it a priority to unite the private sector with government entities to ensure the U.S. is leading the world in the innovation of 5G networks. My bipartisan bill, H.R. 4500, which I've introduced with fellow members of the committee, Representatives Dingell, Brooks, and Clark, plays an important role in providing that unified front of industry and government to assert the United States leadership in the development of 5G standards and technologies across the globe. Specifically, my bill would promote U.S. competitiveness in international 5G technology development by directing the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in consultation with the National Institute for Standards and Technology to encourage participation by trusted American companies and other relevant stakeholders in international standard-setting bodies. The legislation would allow NTIA to offer technical assistance to participants in the course of developing 5G standards and the future of communication networks. Competition is the bedrock of innovation, and the great companies we have in America are leading the way in the advancement of future wireless technologies. I see no better way in promoting those advancements than by using or having U.S. companies play an integral role in setting the standards of international 5G networks. NTIA is the leading agency for spectrum use and our voice in the international arena in securing America's priorities in international technology policy. There's no better agency than NTIA to serve as America's representative in the developments of open and fair international 5G standards. The policy choices being made by the committee today will lay the groundwork for asserting America's dominance in 5G as our international competitors, China and Russia, seek to undermine the security of our nation's telecommunications networks. My legislation would send a clear message that America is and will continue to be the leading voice in the worldwide development of 5G. I want to thank Representatives Dingell, Brooks, and Clark for partnering with me on this bipartisan legislation and the amendment, and I'm hopeful for its adoption so that we can protect U.S. national security, ensure global competitiveness, and maintain cost effectiveness of wireless communications. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any other member who seeks recognition to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, we will proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to be offered to this bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4500 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 4500 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 4500 is forwarded to the full committee. Okay, the chair now calls up H-Res 575, expressing the sense of the House of Representatives that all stakeholders in the deployment of 5G communications infrastructure should carefully consider and adhere to the recommendation of the Prague Principles. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H-Res 575, resolution expressing the sense of the House of Representatives that all stakeholders in the deployment of 5G.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Is there anyone that wishes to offer an amendment? For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H-Res 575 offered by Mr. Flores of Texas.
Without objection, reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to start by thanking Mr. Soto for working with me on this resolution. This amendment makes technical corrections and clarifications to H-Res 575, a resolution which Mr. Soto and I introduced earlier this year. This resolution, as you know, recognizes a set of 5G security proposals that the United States and 31 other countries agreed to in May of this year. These proposals address the risk that bad actors may pose to our next generation networks. They encourage adherence to best practices such as risk assessment, testing, information sharing, and cooperation with consensus-based standards that can keep 5G networks secure. This amendment is based on feedback we got from the FCC, and it allows us to more concisely identify the roles played by trusted stakeholders in the 5G security supply chain, and it clarifies the importance of cooperation between international partners in both the public and private sector. With this additional language, my resolution that Mr. Soto and I introduced will strengthen Congress' clear commitment to secure next-generation networks. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to thank my colleague, the gentleman from Texas, Congressman Flores, for his great work in working with us. We're here today to improve upon access to the internet for all Americans, to improve upon broadband and spectrum, and to prepare for 5G networks to bring our country into the 21st century. Access and accuracy are absolutely critical, and we heard a little bit about that today already. In areas like rural Osceola and Polk County that I represent in Central Florida, internet can be spotty sometimes. And also cell phone service can be spotty. And so it's about making sure that everyone, regardless of where they're from, in Florida's 9th Congressional District or across America, will have that equal access. But we also need to make sure, as we're looking at accuracy and we're looking at access, that we're helping with security. It's a dangerous world out there, and we need to make sure that everybody can trust both the internet and cell phone service and other manners of technology. And so we're looking at the supply chain. And that's where the Prague Proposals that the United States had input in comes into play. And this is more than just watching videos on YouTube or Netflix, and we all love doing that, by the way, or other streaming. It's also about kids in our district doing their homework online and making sure that startup companies in my district can be more competitive and to have a 21st century American economy that can be prosperous. So various Prague proposals are proffered, including making sure that communication networks and services are designed with the resiliency and security in mind, that every country, including the United States, is free to set our own national security and law enforcement standards, that we can have laws and policies governing networks and connectivity that are guided by the principles of transparency and equity, and that overall risk of influence on suppliers by third countries should be taken into account. We saw with the Huawei controversy that Americans we need to be guarded to make sure that we're not going to be spied upon by companies and foreign governments. And so this is also about making sure that American technology and American companies, such as trusted foundries in the United States, will play an increasing role in protecting the security in telecommunications, Places like Bridge in my district that work on microelectronics, work done by the University of Central Florida and Florida Polytechnic in our district, all are going to help out with the supply chain. And then it goes on to discuss proposals for technology, economy, security, privacy, and resilience. In the end, we need a safe and secure 5G network for everyone in the United States, and I'm honored to work with Congressman Flores and others to help make this a reality, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members that wish to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Are there any other amendments? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding HRes 575 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding HRes 575 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and HRes 575 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. And now that brings us to our final bill of the day, H.R. 5035, the Television Viewer Protection Act of 2019. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5035, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to extend expiring provisions related to the
Without objection,
retransmission
first reading of the
signals.
bill was dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and is open to amendment at any point. Are there any people that, anybody that wants to offer amendments? Seeing none, the chair recognizes himself to speak on the bill. First of all, I want to thank Ranking Members Walden and Latta and their staffs for their willingness to work with us to get this bill out of subcommittee. As we heard at our hearing on Stella and saw over in the Senate yesterday, this is a complex issue, and it directly impacts nearly 1 million Americans. The current authorization expires at the end of the year, and I hope we can come together to find a solution to this important issue. I support this bill. I urge my colleagues to do the same as we continue to negotiate on our way to full committee, and I pledge to the chair and the ranking member and the subcommittee ranking member that we will work with you on the way to full committee. And I yield back my time. Mr.
Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Mr. Walden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your comments. Obviously, as you know, we've been a little dissatisfied with the process, how the bill got to us today. It was only introduced hours before the markup was noticed. From my opinion, hasn't had the kind of regular order necessary. To be very clear, Republicans were not consulted about the text that we see here for us today, and so I look forward to a new day in discussions going forward. Since the subcommittee did not have a legislative hearing on the bill, I have a lot of questions for council since we really haven't had a chance to review the bill or understand what it does. We also saw the Senate yesterday, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, pull their bill that had not had a legislative hearing. So it appears this extension isn't yet fully vetted and ready for prime time in either body. And as I mentioned in my statement, we can do media policy through regular order in this committee, just like any other issue. There's no reason we need to try and do these reforms on the basis of unrelated expiring provisions. I had the great privilege of chairing this subcommittee over 6 years with Ms. Eshu as my ranking member, and we went through a stellar stuff something for a long time, and here we are again. And while I'm not yet convinced that Congress should even reauthorize any of these expiring provisions, the chair is willing to, we are willing to allow this to move on a voice vote. I do reserve my right to object at full, and I remain open to talking about these issues as we go into full committee markup. And with that, I would yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone else wish to speak on this? The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I couldn't mean that more when I say thank you for including my bill, the True Fees Act, in the underlying legislation, which obviously reauthorizes the expiring provisions of Stella. This legislation, I think, is common sense, and I think that it's much needed. because we need to require that communications providers include all the below-line fees that they're charging in any prices they advertise. This is straight away something that is affecting Republican households, Democratic households, independent households, north, south, east, west, rural, suburban, and urban. So this is everybody. I don't know if my Republican colleagues have an issue with it, but it does affect every single one of our constituents that have these services. Now, these below-the-line fees, their fees, their charges, their surcharges, and other line items on consumers' bills that companies charge on top of the base price of a service. They're not the taxes. The taxes I'm not speaking to. The taxes are the taxes. These are other fees that are piling up, and our constituents are the ones that have to pay them. They're company-imposed fees, and they really add up. The average consumer pays $450 a year in company-imposed fees on their cable bill, and as I said, this doesn't include federal, state, or local taxes. That's 24% more than the price that was advertised to these consumers, according to a recent study by Consumer Reports. I can't help but think of my beautiful father. He would, you know what he would have called this? He would have said to me, "It's a racket, honey. It's a racket." When someone signs up for broadband at home, cable television, or cell phone service, they don't know that the company is using below-line fees to hide nearly a quarter of the price. Worse, when the companies require consumers to enter into long-term contracts, consumers, I think, legitimately assume that they get to keep the fixed price for the duration of their contract. But companies can and do increase below-the-line fees during the terms of a consumer's contract. So it's kind of like add insult to injury. So right now, the average cable bill includes 13 line item charges and company-imposed fees. I don't know how many of you, if you haven't cut your cord, have you looked at your bill? That's a long list. That's a long list. And it's long. It's not only long, it's confusing, and I think it's purposefully opaque. So it is about money, but I think more importantly, I think we can do something about it. I think essentially we're called to do something about it, and the bill directs itself to that. So I'm hopeful that we will leave open the conversation for broader reforms, but in the meantime, Mr. Chairman, this estimated $28 billion with a B per year from these practices, we really need to do something about this. So I hope Mr. Walden, Mr. Latta, our subcommittee colleagues from both sides will end up supporting this. I think the chairman has taken an important first step by making it part of the underlying bill. So bravo to you for doing it. I appreciate it. And I wish I would hear from someone on the other side of the aisle that says that they want to join in on this. I know that there's some quiet on it. Maybe you don't have to say anything today. You can call me. How's that? But with that, I'll yield back the remainder of my time, Mr. Chairman. But all my thanks for including it in the underlying legislation. I think it's important.
Thanks to the gentlelady. She yields back. Is there anyone seeking recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Latta seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I often mention the great bipartisan nature of this committee. We do serve on the greatest committee in Congress because we sharpen legislation with our differing viewpoints. Last Congress, this committee brought more bills to the House floor than any other committee. We are effective because we work together. So I was disappointed to see that today we are considering the Television Viewer Protection Act, since it did not go through regular order and was not discussed with the minority staff ahead of the introduction. This doesn't seem like the bipartisan work that we do. Both sides deserve the opportunity to voice their opinions on this bill in a legislative hearing, especially when new provisions like true fees are added to an otherwise clean reauthorization. Again, our products are better when we work across the aisle. This is evident through our efforts to combat robocalls and apparent in the other 8 bills we're considering today, from protecting our telecommunications supply chain to creating better broadband maps. However, I appreciate that the majority has agreed to further talk and work with us on this legislation, and hopefully we can get to a better place before moving this bill out of full committee. I thank the chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else seeking recognition? Mr. O'Halloran, for what purpose do you seek recognition? You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also thank you for bringing this bill forward and showing that you're willing to work, as this committee has over time, with the minority also. Today, our focus should be on putting consumers first above all else. Today's video marketplace is very different from what it was since the last time Stellar was considered in 2014. The actions we take in considering this legislation extend far beyond this hearing room and have real-life implications for the national video marketplace. This is especially true for families in rural America who rely on addressing all forms of video content to feel connected to their local communities and to also be informed of our national discourse. We must continue to thoroughly evaluate this legislation in a bipartisan way to ensure it reflects the needs of the entire video marketplace and provides stability for consumers and providers alike. I look forward to working with the chairman and anybody else on this issue, and I look forward to having the chairman working with both sides of the aisle to achieve this goal on behalf of consumers. And I yield.
Thank the gentleman. He yields back. Is there anyone else that seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Long seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In today's video marketplace, consumers are cutting the cord and choosing from a large variety of video options. Competition is growing every day, including Disney Plus, which was launched just this week. If video companies aren't providing bills that are clear enough, consumers can easily switch and choose another video provider. I am fine having a conversation about transparency in the bill, but the majority has not been transparent about their intentions in this bill to ensure that 800,000 satellite customers are not cut off from broadcast signal. We have not had a hearing where the portions of the true fees were discussed. We've not had a legislative hearing on Mrs. Eshu's bill. We have not had a legislative hearing on how to protect satellite customers. The subcommittee mostly works, as you know, on a bipartisan basis and follows regular order. This bill seems like a strange outlier, and I urge the chairman to get us in a better place. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else wishing to speak on the bill? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
To strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd just like to take 1 minute to thank the ranking member Lara, Republican Lara, and also Chairman Democrat Congressman Doyle for working in as a respectful way as possible, even though we have disagreements. What we're witnessing here, of which we're not going to see on television tonight, or it's not going to be repeated anywhere, you have Republicans and Democrats actually not arguing, not fighting, disagreeing, and yet at the same time, by and large, so far voting unanimously, both every Republican president voting and every Democrat president voting to move legislation forward. I just want to point out that today we're demonstrating the respect and the dignity that was afforded to us, our responsibility by the people who elected all of us in this great country. And unfortunately, the media doesn't point out moments like this or days like this or committees like this. Again, we're disagreeing on some issues today, but we're being respectful, we're being honorable, and I think that it's important that we take at least a moment to recognize that that is, in fact, what the people deserve, and that is, in fact, what we're demonstrating today. So once again, I'd like to say congratulations to all the members of this committee, and especially the two leaders of this subcommittee, the ranking member and the chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition to speak on the bill? Okay. Seeing none, question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 5035 to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 5035 is forwarded to the full committee. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bills consistent with actions taken by the committee today. The chair seeks unanimous consent to enter the following into the record: a letter from the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, a coalition letter from ITTA, ACA Connects, NTCA, NRECA, and WTA, and at the request of the minority, a letter from the U.S. Copyright Office, a letter from NBC Universal, a letter from CBS, a letter from Fox, a letter from ABC. Without objections, so ordered. I want to thank all the members of the subcommittee for your work today and for the cooperative spirit that we've worked in today, and we pledge to continue to work with you as we go to full committee. This committee now stands adjourned.
Thanks, guys.